Good evening. My name is Evan Gregory, and this is Bible Answers. We're going to be finishing up our study in Acts chapter 21 tonight. So feel free to follow along. I will have all the verses on the screen here. And getting straight into the study, remember last week we were beginning of chapter 21 is basically Paul traveling. He's making his way back to Jerusalem. And what we see is that pretty much everywhere he's going is people are saying, "Hey, bad things going to happen to you at Jerusalem," and so we pick up. We ended in verse 21 last week to where Paul has made his way to Jerusalem, but there's this question that James brings forth, and that what we see here is that there are some who will say that Paul is saying that he's teaching. Um, Basically the Jews to forsake Moses, that they shouldn't follow the law, and what we see here is that what Paul did teach was that the law, the old law, is no longer binding. He speaks in his other letters, other epistles. He spends much time talking about the fact that people are no longer bound to the law of Moses; they're only bound to Christ. And we see that the Jews continue to have problems with this. This was a big issue going back in Acts chapter 15, that at that time there was these Judaizing teachers that said, "Hey, you need to be circumcised in order to be saved," and that was dealt with. But it seems as though people still have issues with whether or not one should keep the law. And one thing that just a new nuance here, I guess you would say about this, is that when we think about the customs of the Jews, these things were not, um, you know, wrong in and of themselves in order to do. If one wanted to be circumcised, if they just wanted to keep eating the certain foods in which they ate, that's perfectly fine. The problem is when one binds that, and basically they have to do that in order to be justified by God. That is where the problem comes in, and so it we see here that there's Paul is teaching that these things are don't matter. They you can't be justified by these things, and we see where people are have this big issue with what Paul is teaching here, and so that leads us into verses 22 through 25. And so James here, he's talking to him in verse 21, verses 17 to 21, and he wants to kind of clear up this issue. And it seems as though James still has some problems with this as well. And so it takes us to verses 22 through 25. It says, "What then? The assembly must certainly meet, for they will hear that you have come. Therefore, do what we tell you. We have 4 men who have taken a vow. Take them and be purified with them, and pay their expenses, so they may shave their heads, and that all may know that those things which they were informed concerning you are nothing, but that you yourself also walk orderly and keep the law. But concerning the Gentiles who believe, we have written and decided they should observe no such thing, except that they should keep themselves from things offered to idols, from blood, from things strangled, and from sexual immorality." And so we see where it looks like what James here is saying is that, hey, do this, and kind of show that you're not saying, um, stop keeping the law, to go in and be purified with these individuals. And so, what it looks like here is that these men have taken, at least in regards to the circumstances here, in which they shave their heads, and then they pay their expenses. And I would assume this is paying their expenses in order to have to offer sacrifices. That this is these men have taken a Nazarite vow. And so you may be thinking here, well, why is Paul here then being called to go in with these men and be purified with them? And one thing that I should make note here is that it's not clear I don't think what is being said here is that Paul should take this vow with these other men. And it looks like what's going on here, in regards to circumstances, and we'll look at this later a little bit more here in the next few verses, is that when one takes a Nazarite vow and this person becomes unclean in some way, they need to be purified. That they're basically washed themselves, in which they're cleansed. They shave their heads, and then they offer sacrifices in order to make things right again. And so this seems what's going on here is that these men here with James, that he would go in with and be purified with them. And uh, another thing that should be made clear here is that this idea of being purified is that anyone who is considered to be unclean, in order to actually go into the temple, is that they need to be purified as well. And so it's I think that it's wrong to assume that Paul is taking a vow here, and but he is just going with these men into the temple, and then for them to actually go into, or for him to go into it, he has to be purified as well. And so he's doing these things, and the question may arise: is why is he doing that when he's saying, "Hey, you don't need to be doing these things. You don't have to be. You're not justified by." The Jewish law. And I think this is another example of Paul becoming all things to all men, that he recognizes these things are nothing, but just doing these things. So, for example, shaving one's head or an offering this sacrifice in and of itself, there's nothing wrong with it. Again, it's when you're connecting it in order to be justified with God. That's where the problem starts here. And so he's doing these things. It seems like he's doing this just to kind of get a good reputation with the Jews. But we know from other places that he is going to continue to preach the gospel. That he is not bound to keep to keep the law of Moses any longer. And so this takes us to verses 26 through 29. It says, Then Paul took the men, and the next day, having been purified with them, entered the temple to announce the expiration of the days of purification, at which time an offering should be made for each one of them. Now, when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews from Asia, seeing him in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd and laid hands on him, crying out, Men of Israel, help! This is the man who teaches all men everywhere against the people of the law and this place. And furthermore, he also brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place. For they had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian with him in the city, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple. So Paul, he takes them in, he's purified with them, and then they go into the temple to announce the expiration of the days of the purification. So how this would work is they would be purified, and then this would go in. Then they would set up, basically set. There would be a 7 day period after this, and then on the eighth day they would offer up sacrifices. So he goes in, and we see where Paul is purified with him, and then when the 7 days were almost ended, we see this problem that erupts, and they see Paul in this temple, and they recognize who he is. He's Paul. He's the one that's teaching people to forsake the law of Moses. And we see also where they bring in a false charge against him, saying that he brought Greeks into the temple and defiled this holy place. And so what they thought was that Trophimus, an Ephesian, so a Gentile, that he was brought into this temple, which was not supposed to happen, but in actuality did not happen. He was just with Paul, but did not actually enter. And so Paul here, seemingly trying to, again, I think he's another example of him trying to win over the Jews and not necessarily saying, "Hey, I agree with what you believe," but this turns against him. That the Jews are out to get him, they're out to lay hands on him, and this seems to be a common theme for Paul here lately in the last few chapters of Acts. So it takes us to verses 30 through 34. It says, "And all the city was disturbed, and the people ran together, seized Paul, and dragged him out of the temple. And immediately the doors were shut. Now, as they were seeking to kill him, news came to the commander of the garrison that all Jerusalem was in uproar. He immediately took soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. And when they saw the commander and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. Then the commander came near and took him and commanded him to be bound with 2 chains. And he asked who he was and what he had done. Some among a multitude cried one thing and some another. So when he could not ascertain the truth because of the tumult, he commanded him to be taken into the barracks. So they try to kill Paul. They drag him out of the temple, and news meets the garrison that was in Jerusalem. Now remember, Jerusalem, Israel, is part of Rome at this time, and so these would be Roman soldiers that hear of this, and they hear of this uproar, and they go down, and they take hold of Paul here, and they try to figure out who he was, and it says here that some among the multitude cried one thing and some another. But kind of reminds you, I believe, in Acts chapter 19, I believe it's where it took place, was the riot at Ephesus, in which there was just this mass confusion as to what was going on. And it's similar here as well, that they're crying one thing or another, and the commander here cannot figure out what's happening. And so this is just chaos here. That this is not just, it's not just a little street fight. It's not just a little tussle, but it's almost as if another riot has broken out, to where the military comes in and stops this uproar here. And so they're trying to figure out who Paul is. And in verses 35 through 40, it says that some among the multitude cried one thing and another, and I have part of this already on the other screen. It says he commanded him to be taken into the barracks. When he reached the stairs, he had to be carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the mob. For the multitude of the people followed after, crying out, "Away with him!" Then as Paul was about to be led into the barracks, he said to the commander, "May I speak to you?" He replied, "Can you speak Greek? Are you not the Egyptian who some time ago stirred up a rebellion and led the 4,000 assassins out into the wilderness?" But Paul said, "I'm a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, and I implore you, permit me to speak to the people." So when he had given him permission, Paul stood on the stairs and motioned with his hand to the people. And when there was a great silence, he spoke to them in the Hebrew language. So, again, complete chaos, and he has to be carried up the stairs by the soldiers because the mob was so violent that it's almost as if he has to be lifted up and away from these people trying to get after him. And we see that the commander thinks that Paul is someone else. That and it's very interesting, and I think it speaks to the confusion of what's going on here. Is that the commander has somehow come to the conclusion that he is an Egyptian who apparently led a rebellion sometime in the past, and so again, these people have absolutely no idea what's going on, but it's complete. I mean, the only thing that they know is they got to get Paul, and it looks like he's surprised by Paul speaking to the commander by him asking, "Can you speak Greek?" But Paul says that he's a Jew. He's Tarsus in Cilicia. Not only is he a Jew, but he's also a Roman citizen, and so he has some legitimacy. He's not some just crazy man. He's a Roman citizen, and that gives him certain rights. Being that the Roman government gives him rights that was not given to non-citizens, and so he was a Roman, and he's given permission by this commander to speak to the people that's after him, and that would take us into chapter 22, which we'll start next time. And so, as always, if you have any questions or comments, leave a comment here on our Facebook page. Uh, Leave them on our YouTube page. Our YouTube page is North Columbus Church of Christ. All these videos are uploaded there, and certainly like to have a conversation here, talk about these things, and I hope this has been useful for you. And so, until next time, I hope that you all have a good day, good rest of the week, and thanks for tuning in.